The first time I realized I was different, I was 7 years old. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, no grand confrontation or cruel words, just a quiet certainty that settled in my chest as I watched my cousins parade their new toys through my grandparents' grand estate. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath their feet, their laughter echoing through the cavernous halls. I stood at the edge of the room, hands stuffed into the pockets of my second-hand jeans, watching as Trevor, my older cousin, boasted about the limited edition sneakers his father had imported from Italy. I had nothing to contribute. I never did. My father had walked out before I was born, leaving my mother, Lillian, to raise me alone. She had the unfortunate luck of being the disappointment of the family, the one who never married rich, never secured a place in the family's good graces. Because of this, we were treated as afterthoughts, shadows lurking at the fringes of every family gathering. That didn't stop them from flaunting what we didn't have. Uncles in tailored suits clinked glasses filled with expensive whiskey. Aunts draped in silk and diamonds gossiped about socialite scandals. My cousins, Trevor, Isabel, Marcus, each dressed in designer labels, each dripping with the easy arrogance of those born into wealth, relished in reminding me of my place. "Where'd you get those shoes, John?" "A thrift store," Trevor sneered once, nudging his sister as they both laughed. I had looked down at my sneakers, scuffed, worn from months of wear, and merely shrugged. My silence fueled their amusement, but I refused to give them the reaction they wanted. It was a pattern that would continue for years. While they were chauffeured to private schools, I woke up at dawn to catch the public bus. While they spent summers abroad, I worked at the local grocery store, stocking shelves, sweeping floors. My mother worked 2 jobs, yet we never quite escaped the undertone of pity or disdain that followed us to every family function. "John should be grateful we even invite him," my aunt once whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. Grateful. That word became the chains they expected me to wear. But they didn't know me. If they had, they would have realized that every insult, every dismissive glance, only fueled my resolve. I buried myself in work, clawed my way through college, and learned every financial trick in the book. I didn't have connections like they did, but I had an unwavering determination they would never understand. I made my first real investment at 24, took calculated risks, worked obsessively, and built something of my own. By 30, I had surpassed them all. While they coasted on inherited wealth, I accumulated my own fortune. I bought properties, started businesses, and made investments that turned to gold. But the greatest satisfaction didn't come from the money. It came from the knowledge that I had done it without them. And yet, despite my success, they pretended not to notice. No congratulations. No acknowledgement. Just the same indifference they had always shown. Until they saw a way to benefit. The shift was subtle at first. Invitations that never used to come suddenly arrived. Casual messages from Isabel. "Hey, John. Haven't seen you in a while." Dripping with forced familiarity. Trevor's patronizing attempts at small talk whenever we crossed paths. And then, my mother's plea. "They want you to come to dinner," she had said, her voice hesitant, as though she already knew my answer. I had laughed. Why? Did they finally remember I exist? She sighed. "John, please. Just this once. For me. For her." It was always for her. I hesitated. Every instinct told me this was a trap, another opportunity for them to assert their superiority. But the weight in my mother's voice made me pause. She had spent years enduring their condescension, their veiled insults. Maybe part of her still longed for their approval, still clung to the hope that things could change. And so, against my better judgment, I agreed. One dinner. One night. I told myself I could endure it. What I didn't know, what I should have expected, was that they had no intention of letting this be just another dinner. No, this was something far more calculated. This was a test. And they were about to realize that the black sheep they had cast aside wasn't just different anymore. He was untouchable. The invitation had been sitting in my inbox for a week before I even considered responding. Belmont Grill. An upscale steakhouse in the heart of the city. The kind of place where the elite gathered to flaunt their wealth through overpriced cuts of meat and rare bottles of wine. I had driven past it countless times, but I had never set foot inside. Not because I couldn't afford it. On the contrary, I could probably buy the entire restaurant if I wanted to, but because places like that reeked of everything I despised about my family. I had no doubt the dinner was a setup. My mother's voice had been unusually soft, her words carefully chosen when she asked me to attend. That alone was a red flag. "They want to see you, John," she had said over the phone. I had scoffed. Since when? Her silence had stretched too long before she replied, "It's just dinner. Please." That was how they got to me, through her. And so, against my better judgment, I found myself walking into Belmont Grill, the scent of sizzling prime rib and expensive perfume clashing in the air. The maitre d' barely glanced at me before leading me to the private dining section. A long table sat in the center of the dimly lit room, filled with faces I hadn't seen in years. They looked exactly the same. Isabel, Trevor, my aunts and uncles, each one dressed to the nines, each one exuding the same smugness they had perfected over the years. Trevor saw me first. His lips curled into a smirk, a glint of amusement flickering in his eyes. Well, if it isn't Johnny Boy. I clenched my jaw at the nickname. I hadn't been Johnny Boy since we were kids, since Trevor used to shove me into lockers and laugh about it with his friends. "Trevor," I said coolly, sliding my hands into my pockets. My mother, sitting at the far end of the table, gave me a strained smile. "John, come sit." I moved toward an empty chair, only to watch as Trevor casually slid into it at the last second, his grin widening. "Oh, my bad," he said mockingly. "Didn't see you there." Isabel giggled, sipping from her wine glass, while my uncle shook his head, murmuring something under his breath about kids these days. I let the silence stretch between us before turning to the nearest table. A couple sat there, engaged in quiet conversation over their meal. I leaned down, catching their attention. "Excuse me," I said smoothly. "Would you mind if I borrowed this chair?" The man looked surprised but nodded. Sure." With a polite smile, I grabbed the chair and carried it back to the table, deliberately dragging it against the floor just enough to make the sound grate against their ears. I set it down, took my seat, and looked Trevor dead in the eye. His smirk faltered. I didn't miss the way Isabel's fingers twitched against her wine glass. The conversation resumed, but the air was thicker now. I could feel their eyes on me, weighing, calculating. This wasn't just dinner. It was an evaluation. They wanted to see how much of the old John was still there, the quiet, submissive outcast they could push around. Too bad for them. The server arrived, passing out menus the size of novels. The family wasted no time in ordering, rattling off dishes with the ease of people who had never once checked a price in their lives. Filet mignon, aged ribeye, lobster tails, imported truffles, top-shelf wine. They laughed and joked, feigning warmth, but I saw it for what it was. A performance. Trevor leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of whiskey. "So, Johnny Boy, what have you been up to?" I met his gaze evenly. "Working." He snorted. "Still." My lips quirked up. "Yeah, you should try it sometime." Isabel choked on her drink. My uncle, who had been cutting into his steak, set his knife down with an audible clink. Trevor's smirk wavered. "Relax, man. It's just a question." I didn't respond. Let them stew in the discomfort. Let them wonder how much I knew, how much I had seen through their act. The waiter returned, this time placing a bottle of wine in front of us. "Compliments of the house," he announced. My aunt beamed. "Oh, wonderful. We'll take another one of these, please." Another round of laughter. Another extravagant order placed. The more they drank, the more transparent they became. They made a show of discussing their latest vacations, their business ventures, the little people they employed. I watched, silent, taking in every detail. Then, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. The bill. A sleek leather folder was placed discreetly at the center of the table, and before anyone could reach for it, the waiter smoothly slid it in front of me. I stared at the number. $3,247. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the table. No one spoke, but I could feel their anticipation. They were waiting, expecting. Trevor leaned forward, grinning. "Hope you don't mind covering this, Johnny Boy. I mean, this is nothing for you, right?" Isabel nodded, feigning innocence. "Yeah, John. You're doing so well for yourself. This should be easy." I looked at my mother. She wasn't meeting my eyes. A slow, deliberate silence stretched between us. Then, I slid the bill across the table, right back to Trevor. His smile froze. Isabel blinked. The tension snapped so fast, it was almost audible. Trevor let out a forced chuckle. "Funny, but seriously." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "I am serious. The weight of reality crashed into the room. For the first time all evening, my family looked genuinely startled. They had expected the same old John, the pushover, the one who took their insults, their dismissals, their superiority, and swallowed it down like medicine. Not this time. Trevor's voice hardened. Come on, man. Don't be like that. I tilted my head. Like what? He opened his mouth, then closed it. No one knew what to say, and I enjoyed every second of it. The weight of the check sat in the center of the table like an undetonated bomb. For the first time all evening, my family wasn't laughing. The air had shifted, their smug confidence flickering like a candle about to be snuffed out. I watched Trevor stare at the bill, his grin faltering, his fingers tightening around the stem of his whiskey glass. No one had expected this. They had anticipated an easy night, a meal paid for by the black sheep they had spent years dismissing. In their minds, my success wasn't truly mine. It was a fluke, something they could leech off when convenient. I let the silence stretch, savoring their discomfort. Isabel was the first to recover, her voice laced with faux sweetness. Oh, come on, John. Don't be ridiculous. You know this is nothing for you. I tilted my head slightly, giving her a small, amused smile. Then it should be nothing for you, either. Her expression froze for a fraction of a second before she forced out a laugh. A calculated move. She wasn't used to me pushing back. None of them were. My uncle, Marcus, one of the loudest voices in the family, cleared his throat. Look, let's not make a big deal out of this. It's just a dinner, John. We all know you're more than capable of covering it. I took a slow sip of my drink before setting the glass down carefully. I didn't order half the things on this table. My voice was calm, measured, but I knew they heard the finality in it. Trevor finally spoke, forcing out a chuckle as he leaned forward, attempting to regain control. Jesus, man, what's with the attitude? It's just a meal. A $3,000 meal. I tapped the bill with my finger. A meal I didn't invite myself to. A meal you all assumed I'd pay for. His jaw tightened. That's exactly what happened. I cut in smoothly. The second I walked in, you made a show of how much you were ordering. Expensive cuts of steak. Top-shelf wine. Extra bottles. Desserts no one touched. You assumed I'd pick up the tab without question, just because I can. I exhaled slowly. Why? My words lingered in the air. No one answered. Trevor drummed his fingers against the table, a muscle in his jaw twitching. Isabel's expression had darkened, her attempts at warmth slipping away. My uncle had gone quiet, while the rest of my relatives avoided eye contact, suddenly very interested in their empty plates. The first cracks in their confidence. I leaned back in my chair, glancing at the untouched desserts they had ordered just for show. A plate of chocolate soufflé, melting under the dim lighting. A half-eaten creme brulee, its sugary top barely cracked. So what now? I asked casually, arching a brow. Who's paying? Trevor scoffed, pushing the bill back toward me. Don't be petty, man. I didn't move. His fingers tapped against the leather folder, more forceful this time. John. I smiled. Trevor. For the first time, his composure wavered. He glanced at Isabel, silently asking for backup. She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. You're acting like you can't afford it, she said, her tone clipped. It's embarrassing, honestly. I let out a quiet laugh. Embarrassing? No. What's embarrassing is watching grown adults scramble because they finally have to pay their own way. Trevor's jaw clenched. You're unbelievable. No. What's unbelievable is the entitlement in this room. I gestured toward the table. Not one of you even considered splitting the bill. You just assumed I'd take care of it because, in your minds, I owe you something. Silence. I continued, my voice calm but unwavering. But I don't. I owe you nothing. Not after the years of ridicule. Not after the constant reminders that I was the outsider, the black sheep. Not after you spent years pretending I didn't exist, until you saw an opportunity to benefit. A beat passed. Then another. Trevor's fingers curled into fists. You're making a scene. I glanced around. A few diners at nearby tables had begun to take notice, their curious gazes flickering in our direction. Some pretended not to listen, while others openly watched, fascinated by the tension unfolding in front of them. Good. I turned back to Trevor. The scene was already made the second you all decided to use me. My mother, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, hesitant. John, please. I met her gaze. There was something almost pleading in her expression, a quiet desperation. But this wasn't about her. I had spent my entire life making things easier for others, lowering my voice, shrinking myself, letting them dictate the rules. Not tonight. I pushed back my chair and stood. Trevor blinked. Where are you going? The lounge. I straightened my suit jacket. You all have a bill to figure out. Panic flickered in his eyes. Wait, John, don't be a... I turned and walked away. Behind me, I heard hushed whispers, the frantic rustling of wallets, the clinking of glasses being set down too hard. The reality was sinking in. They were stuck, trapped in their own arrogance. And I had never felt freer. The lounge was dimly lit, a quiet contrast to the tension of the dining area. A jazz band played softly in the background, and the scent of aged whiskey filled the air. I ordered a drink and settled into one of the leather chairs, exhaling slowly. For the first time all evening, I felt a sense of calm. I had expected them to try something tonight, but I hadn't expected to enjoy watching their plan collapse so thoroughly. I took a slow sip of my drink. They would have to pay their own way tonight. They would scramble, argue, maybe even make some desperate calls. I didn't care. For once, they were the ones left feeling powerless. And it was about damn time. The warmth of the whiskey burned pleasantly as I took a slow sip, settling deeper into the plush leather chair in the lounge. The jazz band played a slow, mellow tune in the background, a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind at the dinner table. I knew exactly what was happening in that private dining room. Whispers turning into frantic discussions, glances darting from one person to another, hands fumbling through designer wallets that were rarely used for anything other than luxury shopping. They were panicking. Good. They had expected me to cave, to sigh in exasperation, throw my credit card onto the table, and reinforce the very belief they held on as so dearly, that I would always be the outlier, the expendable success story they could exploit whenever it suited them. But tonight, they were learning that their game no longer worked. I took another sip and exhaled slowly, feeling the tension of the evening slowly unravel from my shoulders. I had no reason to rush back. Let them stew in the reality of their own entitlement. But, predictably, the peace didn't last long. The soft scuff of expensive leather shoes against the carpet caught my attention before I even looked up. Trevor stood a few feet away, hands shoved into his pockets, trying to appear casual. But the tightness in his jaw, the barely concealed frustration in his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. I didn't say anything, waiting for him to make the first move. He exhaled sharply and took a seat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Look, man, he started, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. We both know this is stupid. You've made your point. So just pay the damn bill, and let's move on. I took my time setting my glass down before meeting his gaze. No. His grin twitched. Come on, Johnny boy. I tilted my head. That nickname hasn't worked on me in years. Try again. His jaw clenched for a fraction of a second before he smoothed his expression. Jesus, you're really gonna drag this out, huh? I shrugged. Not my problem. He scoffed, leaning back. You're seriously telling me that a $3,000 tab is a big deal for you? The great John. I cut him off with a slow, measured chuckle. You think this is about money? I leaned forward, mirroring his posture. Trevor, I could buy this entire restaurant and not feel it. Hell, I could probably buy your condo just to evict you for fun. But that's not the point. His expression darkened. The point, I continued, my voice dropping slightly, is that you all assumed I'd take care of it. That you didn't even hesitate before putting it on me. That even after all these years, you still see me as the one you can step on when it's convenient. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. I exhaled, shaking my head. So no, Trevor, I'm not paying. He ran a hand down his face, frustration leaking through his carefully constructed mask. All right, fine. You're pissed. I get it. But this is bigger than you now. You're putting the entire family in a bad spot. I let out a slow, unimpressed breath. That sounds like a them problem. He laughed humorlessly, shaking his head. Damn, man. You really don't give a shit, do you? I lifted my drink in a mock toast. Not anymore. Trevor sat there for a long moment, staring at the glass in my hand, his mind racing through a dozen different approaches. I could practically see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was used to being the one in control, the golden boy of the family, the one who dictated the social hierarchy. But not tonight. Finally, he let out a breath and leaned back, shaking his head. All right, you win. I arched a brow. That easy. He smirked, but there was no humor in it. I'm not the one you should be worried about. I had barely processed his words before I heard my mother's voice. John. Slowly, I turned my head. She stood a few feet away, her expression carefully composed, but I knew her well enough to see the worry hidden beneath the surface. Her fingers twisted the strap of her purse, a nervous habit. I sighed. Mom. She glanced at Trevor before looking back at me. Can we talk? Trevor took the opportunity to push himself to his feet. I'll leave you two to it, he said, straightening his jacket. But before he left, he paused beside me and clapped a hand on my shoulder. Don't make her cry, Johnny boy. Then he was gone. I turned my attention back to my mother. I know why you're here. She sighed, moving to take Trevor's vacant seat. John, I understand why you're upset. I'm not upset, I corrected, swirling the last of my whiskey. I'm just done. She hesitated. But they're family. I let out a quiet laugh. No, Mom. You and I, we're family. The rest? They're just people I happen to share a bloodline with. Her lips pressed together, and for a moment, she looked down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. I don't want this to be the thing that breaks us apart. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. Mom, we were never together in the first place. You know that. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over mine, squeezing lightly. John, I just want you to be happy. I met her gaze. I am. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. She studied me for a long moment before finally nodding. All right, she whispered. Then, she stood, smoothing down her dress. I should go back before they send someone else. I nodded. She hesitated, as if debating whether to say something else. But in the end, she just gave me a small, tired smile and turned to leave. I watched her go, knowing that tonight had changed things. For better or worse, the balance of power had shifted, and I had no intention of ever letting them take it back. I watched my mother disappear back through the dimly lit hallway, leaving me alone in the lounge with the quiet hum of jazz and the last remnants of my whiskey. I knew exactly what was happening beyond those doors, where my so-called family sat in their overpriced suits and dresses, grappling with the weight of a bill they had never intended to pay. For years, they had dictated the rules. They controlled the pecking order, decided who was worthy of acknowledgement, and who, like me, existed only as an afterthought. But tonight, the entire script had been flipped, and they were scrambling to adjust to a reality they had never considered possible. I set my empty glass down and exhaled slowly. Time to twist the knife. The moment I stepped back into the private dining room, the tension was palpable. The laughter and easy arrogance that had dominated the evening had evaporated, leaving behind a thick, uncomfortable silence. Their faces were a study in barely concealed panic. Some masked it better than others, but I saw it in the way Trevor's jaw was set too tight, the way Isabel was fidgeting with her bracelet, the way my Uncle Marcus kept glancing at the check like it was a live grenade. Every single one of them was waiting for a miracle. I let the moment stretch, taking my time as I casually approached the table. I didn't sit. Instead, I stopped at the head of the table, standing over them the way they had once stood over me. Then I smiled. You guys look like you've seen a ghost. Trevor was the first to recover. He forced a chuckle, leaning back in his chair as if he hadn't just spent the past 10 minutes internally calculating how much of a financial hit he could afford. John, come on. Let's not drag this out. Just pay the damn bill, and we can all go home. I arched a brow. Oh, so now it's my responsibility? Isabel scoffed. Don't be dramatic. You've got more money than all of us combined. What's a few $1,000s to you? I hummed in amusement. That's funny. A few hours ago, none of you cared what I had. Now suddenly, it's the only thing that matters. Silence. Marcus sighed, running a hand down his face. John, let's be reasonable. You're obviously trying to make a point, but you've made it. Now, let's settle this like adults. I let my gaze sweep over the table. Like adults? You mean like the way adults should split a bill instead of dumping it on the one person they think they can manipulate? My aunt shifted uncomfortably. It's not like that. I leaned forward slightly, bracing my hands on the back of a chair. Isn't it? The weight of my words settled over them, and for the first time, I saw something flicker behind Trevor's eyes, something that almost looked like doubt. He knew. Deep down, he knew I was right. But pride was a hell of a thing, and he wasn't about to admit defeat. So he did what he always did. He laughed. Jesus, man, you're really going to make this a whole thing. He shook his head, looking around the table like he expected someone to jump in and back him up. We're family. This is what family does. I let out a quiet chuckle, shaking my head. No, Trevor, this is what your family does. You take, and you take, and you take, until there's nothing left. And the moment someone stops letting you, suddenly, they're the villain. His smirk twitched. Come on, man. It's just money. I tilted my head. Then pay it. His jaw clenched. I mean, it's just money, right? I continued, my voice casual. You've always been the big shot. The golden boy. You've had every advantage handed to you your entire life. So why is this such a problem? He had no response. And that was the moment I knew I had him. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The reality of their situation was sinking in, and they had no idea how to handle it. So, I decided to give them one final gift. I exhaled dramatically and ran a hand through my hair, pretending to consider. All right, fine. Trevor perked up immediately. Yeah. I nodded, letting the relief settle in their eyes. Sure, I'll cover it. A collective exhale. The tension in the room visibly eased. Shoulders relaxed, expressions softened. Then I smiled. But only my part. And just like that, the relief shattered. Trevor blinked. What? I pulled my wallet from my pocket, slipping out a few crisp bills and tossing them onto the table. I ordered a steak and a drink. That comes out to what? $100? There you go. Their stunned silence was delicious. Trevor's nostrils flared. You're joking. I shrugged, sliding my hands into my pockets. Not at all. You said it yourself, Trevor. It's just money. A strangled sound escaped from Isabel's throat. You absolute. Careful. I cut in smoothly, tilting my head. You wouldn't want to embarrass yourself in public. Her face burned red, but she swallowed whatever insult she had been about to hurl at me. Trevor, meanwhile, looked like he was about to combust. His fingers dug into the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. You seriously expect us to split this? I arched a brow. Isn't that what adults do? The reminder of his own words hit him like a slap. Aunt Margaret, who had been silent until now, cleared her throat delicately. Perhaps we should. I'm not splitting shit, Trevor snapped. Marcus groaned, rubbing his temples. Then pay the damn bill yourself, Trevor. You ordered half the damn menu. Trevor's glare turned on him. Oh, so now you've got an opinion? And just like that, the carefully curated image of the perfect family collapsed into chaos. Voices overlapped, accusations were hurled, wallets were reluctantly pulled out. The unity they had always presented to the world crumbled under the weight of reality. And I stepped back, watching the unraveling with quiet satisfaction. For years, I had been the outsider, the black sheep, the one who was supposed to stay in the shadows and accept whatever scraps they offered. But tonight, I had flipped the script. They weren't laughing anymore. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left standing alone. They were. I turned and walked away, leaving them to deal with the mess they had created. I had won. As I walked away from the private dining room, the chaos behind me was still unfolding. The voices had risen, the once pristine illusion of unity crumbling as reality sank its claws into them. Accusations, insults, and whispers of disbelief filled the space I had just left, but I didn't care. Not anymore. I made my way back into the lounge, the soft hum of jazz and the low murmur of other patrons a stark contrast to the disaster I had left behind. I felt the weight on my chest lift with every step, the tight grip my family had on me loosening at last. But I wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. Trevor was too proud, too entitled, to let this go so easily. And I was right. I barely had time to take another sip of my drink before I heard him storming toward me. His heavy footsteps were purposeful, his frustration radiating from him in waves. John. He ground out through clenched teeth, stopping a few feet away from me. I glanced up lazily, swirling my whiskey. That was fast. His jaw clenched. We need to talk. I sighed and set my glass down. We already did. Several times, actually. Cut the crap, he snapped. You know damn well what you just did back there. I leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. Yeah, I made it clear that I'm done being your personal ATM. His nostrils flared. You embarrassed us. I let out a quiet chuckle. No, Trevor. You embarrassed yourselves. I tilted my head slightly. You just don't like that you didn't get your way. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a moment, I wondered if he was actually stupid enough to throw a punch in the middle of a high-end restaurant. But even in his anger, he knew better. Instead, he exhaled sharply and forced himself to calm down, taking a step closer. Look, man, let's just be real for a second. His voice dropped, the charm he always relied on creeping back in. You've got money, more than any of us. This wasn't a big deal for you, but it is for them. I raised a brow. And whose fault is that? Trevor hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. You and the rest of the family have lived your entire lives believing you're entitled to whatever you want. I continued, my voice steady. You spend recklessly, flaunt wealth you barely control, and the moment someone refuses to play along, you call it betrayal. His expression darkened. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, Trevor. I stood, straightening my suit jacket. You and I? We're not the same. I worked for what I have. I built my success from the ground up while all of you coasted on inheritance and connections. And now that the bill has come due, literally, you're scrambling. Trevor exhaled, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. You act like you don't care, but I know you, John. You're not heartless. I gave him a humorless smile. You're right. I'm not. But I also don't reward people who treat me like an afterthought until they need something from me. His lips pressed together, his frustration mounting. Isabel and Mom are upset, you know. Ah, there it was. The last card he had left to play. I let out a quiet breath. I know, and I don't enjoy that. But it's not my job to keep making their lives easier at my own expense. Trevor let out a bitter laugh. You really think this is some grand victory, don't you? I studied him for a moment before answering. No, but it's justice. And with that, I walked past him, leaving him standing there in the lounge, fists clenched and reality pressing down on him like never before. I had barely stepped outside when I heard another voice call my name. John. I turned and saw Isabel hurrying toward me, her heels clicking against the pavement. Her expression was a mixture of frustration and something else, something that almost looked like desperation. I sighed. Isabel, don't. She stopped a foot away from me, crossing her arms tightly. Don't what? I met her gaze evenly. Don't try to guilt me. It won't work. She let out a breath, shaking her head. You don't get it, do you? I arched a brow. Oh, I get it. I get that you all assumed I'd foot the bill without question. I get that none of you even considered paying for your own meals because, in your mind, that's beneath you. I get that for the first time in your life, you're actually facing consequences, and you don't know how to handle it. Her jaw tightened. You think you're better than us now? I let out a humorless laugh. No, I just refuse to let you treat me like I'm beneath you. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. Mom is upset. I sighed, glancing up at the night sky. I know. She's crying, John. I closed my eyes briefly. I had expected that. My mother, for all her flaws, had always been the one person I had a soft spot for. But even she wasn't immune to the toxic influence of our family. She wanted this to be a nice night, Isabel pressed. A chance for us all to be together again. And you ruined it. I let out a slow breath, my patience wearing thin. No, Isabel. What ruined it was the assumption that I would continue playing along, that I would keep letting all of you walk over me just because I've done it in the past. She shook her head, looking away. I don't get why you're doing this. I gave her a long, measured look. Because I finally can. She swallowed hard, but didn't say anything else. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked back toward the restaurant, her shoulders rigid. I didn't stop her. I had said what I needed to say. As I got into my car, my phone started vibrating. I glanced at the screen. 20 missed calls. 15 unread messages. All from family members who, just hours ago, had barely acknowledged my existence. I let out a breath and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat, staring at the road ahead. This night had been inevitable. The breaking point of years of resentment, entitlement, and unspoken expectations. And I didn't regret a single thing. Let them figure out how to handle their own mess. For once, I wasn't the one cleaning it up. The night was quiet as I drove home, the city lights blurring past my window. My phone buzzed again. Another call, another message I wouldn't answer. I had spent the better part of my life being at their beck and call, always the one they could push around, dismiss, or manipulate when it suited them. Not anymore. I exhaled, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the events of the evening replayed in my mind. The disbelief on their faces, the frantic whispers, the realization sinking in that I had finally drawn a line they couldn't cross. It should have felt satisfying. In a way, it did. But there was also a strange hollowness to it, like standing in the middle of an earthquake's wreckage, knowing you had survived, but still staring at the ruins. As I pulled into my driveway, the weight on my shoulders shifted. My home was nothing like the grand estates my family flaunted, but it was mine. Every brick, every inch of space built with my own effort. No one could take it from me. I stepped inside, kicking off my shoes, and sank onto the couch. The silence felt heavier than usual. It was a strange thing, cutting off people who had been in your life for so long, even if they had never truly been there for you. I leaned my head back against the couch, closing my eyes. Then, the buzzing started again. I sighed and grabbed my phone, glancing at the screen. More missed calls, more texts piling up. But one name stood out. Mom. Unlike the others, she hadn't bombarded me with angry messages. Just one text, sitting at the top of my notifications. I just want to talk. Please. I stared at it for a long moment before setting my phone down. I knew what the conversation would be. She would try to reason with me, convince me that what I had done was too harsh, that I should have just paid the bill, smiled, and kept the peace, because that's what she had spent her entire life doing. But I wasn't her, and I wasn't going to be. The next morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through the blinds and the sound of my phone vibrating again. I ignored it at first, stretching and letting the lingering tension from the night before settle into something quieter. Then, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone and checked the messages. And what I saw made me laugh. Family group chat. Isabel, this is a disaster. Trevor, you have no idea what you've done, John. Uncle Marcus, we had to take out a loan to cover the bill. A loan. Aunt Margaret, this got out. People are talking. This is humiliating. Isabel, we had to ask friends for help. Do you know how embarrassing that is? Trevor, this is your fault. You could have ended this easily. I shook my head, scrolling through the messages, each one more desperate than the last. Apparently, when none of them could pay the bill, they had been forced to call in favors. The restaurant had refused to let them leave until the balance was settled, and after several frantic attempts to move money around, they had resorted to reaching out to their wealthy friends for help. Only this time, those friends weren't as eager to bail them out. It wasn't just about money, it was about image. And word had already started spreading. People in their circles were whispering about the once impeccable family that had been caught in a financial mess. I could only imagine the looks on their faces as they realized their carefully curated reputations were slipping through their fingers. And the best part? I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no regret, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were finally facing the consequences of their entitlement. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I sighed, already knowing who it would be. When I opened the door, my mother stood there, her expression caught between worry and quiet disappointment. Mom, I greeted, stepping aside. She walked in without a word, glancing around as if searching for something to ground herself. Finally, she turned to face me, folding her hands together. John, she said softly, this has gone too far. I crossed my arms. Has it? She let out a tired sigh. They're struggling. I let out a short laugh. Struggling? Mom, they're embarrassed. There's a difference. She hesitated. They didn't expect it to go this way. I shook my head. That's the problem, isn't it? They never expect anything to go wrong. Because people like me are always supposed to clean up their mess. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, she was silent. Then, she sighed. I don't want to fight with you. I softened slightly. Neither do I. She looked up at me then, something unreadable in her expression. But I also don't want you to shut everyone out forever. I exhaled slowly. I'm not shutting anyone out. I'm just done playing by their rules. She nodded, as if she understood, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She had spent her whole life caught between wanting to belong and knowing she never fully did. I just want you to be happy, she murmured. I gave her a small, genuine smile. I finally am. She studied me for a long moment before sighing again. All right. And just like that, I knew she wouldn't push anymore. Later that night, as I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I thought about everything that had happened. For the first time, I had stood my ground. And while my family was scrambling, their world cracking apart, I was here, unbothered, Free. They would survive. But they would never make the same mistake again. The city stretched before me, a tapestry of lights flickering against the dark sky. I leaned against the balcony railing, taking in the quiet hum of the world moving on, something my family still hadn't figured out how to do. It had been 2 days since the dinner. 2 days of chaos unraveling in my family's carefully constructed world. 2 days of ignored calls, unread messages, and whispers traveling through their social circles. They weren't just dealing with the aftermath of an unpaid bill. No, the real damage had come from something much deeper, something they had never been forced to confront before. Their own weaknesses, their own entitlement, the realization that, for the first time in their lives, they had to deal with a problem they couldn't shift onto someone else. And the best part? It was all self-inflicted. I checked my phone, skimming through the latest messages in the family group chat. Isabel, Mom won't stop crying. You need to fix this. Trevor, you seriously don't care? Uncle Marcus, we've lost so much respect over this. No one wants to do business with a family that can't even cover a dinner tab. Aunt Margaret, people are talking, John. This isn't just embarrassing, it's damaging. Damaging. That was the word that stood out. I had always known they cared about status more than anything. But seeing them scramble, watching them realize that even their reputation, something they had always assumed was untouchable, could be shaken by something as simple as their own greed, that was something they had never prepared for. I placed my phone face down on the table beside me, exhaling slowly. There was no guilt, no second-guessing. For the first time, I wasn't wondering if I should have done something differently, if I should have taken the easy way out just to keep the peace. I had done the right thing. I had forced them to see themselves for who they truly were, and I was done saving them from that. Later that afternoon, my mother called again. I hesitated before answering, already knowing what the conversation would be. John. Her voice was quieter than usual. I leaned back against the couch, rubbing a hand over my face. Mom. She sighed. I wanted to hear your voice. I paused. You know I'm okay, right? I know. There was a long silence before she spoke again. I just wish things had gone differently. I sighed, closing my eyes for a brief moment. So do I. But that doesn't mean I regret it. I know, she said again. And for the first time, there was no pushback. No attempt to guilt me into making things easier for everyone else. Just acceptance. They'll get over it, I told her. Eventually. She gave a quiet laugh. You know how they are. Yeah, I did. And that's why I knew they weren't just upset about the money. It wasn't even about the embarrassment anymore. It was about something deeper, something far more difficult for them to swallow. The realization that they no longer had control over me, that their tricks, their manipulation, their carefully constructed hierarchy, none of it worked on me anymore. I had shattered the illusion they had clung to for so long. And now, they had to live with that. Mom, I said after a moment, my voice softer now. You don't have to defend them anymore. She inhaled sharply, and I could almost picture her gripping the phone tighter. I know. I let out a slow breath. Good. Another silence stretched between us before she spoke again. I'm proud of you, you know. Something in my chest tightened slightly. I know, I murmured. And this time, I truly believed it. That night, I received one final message from Trevor. Trevor, you really think this changes anything? I stared at it for a long moment before typing a response. Me, it already has. I hit send and turned off my phone. I didn't need to see what came next. Because for the first time in my life, I knew the answer. They had spent years making me feel like the outsider, the black sheep, the one who didn't belong. But in the end, I was the only one who had ever truly stood on my own. And I was finally free.